Alright, welcome to Pivot Table 101. Now the purpose of this section is to really just lay some of the groundwork before we get into the more advanced topics. So we'll practice inserting pivots, manipulating views, exploring some of the basic options, and then later in the course we'll start to dig in deeper. So let's start with a question: why pivot tables? Why are pivot tables one of the most important and powerful tools in Excel when it comes to data analysis? So let's answer this with an example. Let's say you have state-level data spanning multiple years, and you're looking at total population and student population. If you only had access to this data in its raw format, how would you answer the following questions? Number 1, which state had the highest population in 2002? Alright, that one's not so bad. Maybe you could just throw some filters on the header row, drill down to 2002, and then sort column C to answer the question that way. Definitely a perfectly valid approach. But what about number 2? In which year was overall US population the highest? Now you may need to start adding some intermediate steps, to aggregate the data at the national level and then start sorting from there. So definitely still doable, but now it's becoming a little bit more tedious. Which brings us to number 3. Which states saw a decline in student population rate as a function of total population between 2003 and 2004? Now we're starting to get into the type of question that pivot tables are incredibly good at answering. Well, of course, you could answer this question without using a pivot. It would involve multiple, often tedious steps to get there, and that's exactly what pivot tables are designed to do very quickly and very efficiently. And last but not least, what if you don't even know what you're looking for? So each of those 3 questions that we just talked about assume that you have some sense of the story or the trend or the insight that you're trying to expose. What if you're approaching a data set in a purely unbiased way, meaning that you don't know what the story is going to be, and you need an analytics tool that's going to help expose those insights for you? That's another key benefit of pivot tables, and another reason why they're such an important tool in Excel. So quick Pivot Table 101, the way I usually describe it is that pivot tables allow you to easily organize, filter, summarize, and analyze raw data. So, very famous Einstein quote, "Analyzing data without a pivot is like hammering a nail with a noodle." Now, obviously, Einstein didn't actually say that, but it gets the point across. Fact is, if you're analyzing data in Excel and you're not using pivot tables, you're making your life 10,000 times harder than it needs to be. Pivot tables are the tools that enable efficient data analytics in Excel, and they will make your life much, much easier. So think of a pivot table as kind of like a layer that sits on top of a raw data set. So you're not actually replicating the data, you're just creating a lens through which you can slice and dice and filter and organize and really explore your data in a very flexible and powerful way. So to wrap things up, I want to talk about the 5 key benefits to remember about pivot tables. Number 1, they're powerful. They allow you to uncover new insights and answer important questions about your data. Second, they can be beautiful. You can apply custom styles, conditional formatting rules, and even charts and graphs to help bring those pivots to life. Number 3, they're incredibly fast. You can build customized views, add filters, calculate brand new fields in a matter of seconds. Fourth, they're accurate. This is an important one. By automating calculations through a pivot table, you can minimize human error and avoid mistakes that you would have made trying to approach the same problem manually. And last but not least, number 5, pivot tables are unbelievably flexible. So you can manipulate table layouts, create dynamic views and reports that you can update and adjust with a click of a button. So there you go. Powerful, beautiful, fast, accurate, and flexible. Alright, now before we get our hands dirty and start working with actual pivots, it's incredibly important to understand that a pivot table is only as strong as the data behind it. There is a right and a wrong way to structure your source data, and this lecture is about helping you understand the difference. A good data structure is rectangular, with variables laid out as columns with clear header names, and observations laid out as rows. If your data is flip-flopped or transposed, you really won't be able to analyze it in any sort of logical way using a pivot. Good source data is also free of unnecessary formatting. Formats like number types, font styles, cell fills, etc. won't pass through to a pivot table anyway, so it's a best practice to keep things simple and clean on the back end. Your source data should only contain dimensions and measures. Think of dimensions as categorical fields and measures as numerical fields. Don't add any additional header or footer rows, since Excel will automatically identify column headers based on the first row in your source data range. Finally, your raw source data shouldn't contain any subtotal rows or calculated fields. Pivot tables are designed to do those sorts of calculations for you and to do those in a more accurate and flexible way, so adding any fields aside from the raw values in your source data will only make things more complicated. Now on the flip side, a bad data structure might be transposed with variables as rows and observations as columns. It might be laid out in an unstructured or non-rectangular way, or maybe it contains unnecessary formatting, calculated fields, misleading column names, or extra header rows. The bottom line is that the only role your source data needs to play is to store the raw values for your pivot table to analyze. Your best bet is to keep things clean and simple and apply your formats and calculated fields using the pivot table itself. Now let's go ahead and practice inserting a pivot table in Excel. And luckily Excel makes it incredibly easy to do so. In the Insert menu, you have two options. You can select Pivot Table to create a blank pivot, where you determine what data you're analyzing and where the pivot table will live, or you can use the Recommended Pivot Table options, which will allow you to browse some pre-populated starting points. Now, if I'm being honest, I don't find the recommendations very helpful. Personally, I prefer to just build my pivot tables from scratch, but it's important to know that those recommendations do exist if you choose to use them. So let's jump into Excel and actually practice this. Alright, so here I am in Excel. I've opened up the IMDb movie database file available in the course resources, and there are a few different ways that I can insert a pivot from here. Excel is actually really smart and helpful when it comes to inserting pivots. So the simplest way to do this is to simply select any cell from within the source data that you care about, go into the Insert menu, and press Pivot Table. And as you can see, even though I only selected one cell, it's identified a range from A1 through R3726. If I scroll to the right, you'll see that it's identified R as the last column and row 3726 as the last row. So even though I had only manually selected one cell, Excel was able to identify the outer bounds of this data range and populate the reference accordingly. Now the second part of this prompt says, okay, where do you want this pivot table to be placed? By default, it will typically show New Worksheet, which is what I prefer. Otherwise, if you have an existing worksheet that you'd like to add the pivot table to, you can do that as well. In this case, let's choose New Worksheet and press OK. And there you go. We've got a new worksheet created, a blank pivot table template here, and then we have our field list off to the right, which we're going to dive into in the next lecture. So that's the simplest way to insert a pivot table. Keep in mind that some other options are to select the specific data range first. So if I only selected, let's say A1 through P26, and then I chose Insert Pivot Table. Since I had selected a specific range, Excel in this case says, okay, he doesn't care about any of the columns after P or after row 26. We'll use this reference for the pivot, and you could press OK there. A third approach, which is a bit more manual, would be to insert a new tab first, then choose Insert Pivot Table, and then navigate to the actual IMDb movie database and select your data from there. So a few different ways to do it. I'd recommend the first approach that we took. I'll just delete this sheet because it really is the simplest way to get started. So there you go. We have our blank pivot. In the next lecture, we'll talk about actually creating and manipulating some views. The first step towards mastering pivot tables is understanding exactly how the field list works. Think of the field list as your cockpit or your command center, where you can drag and drop your fields to customize exactly how the data in your pivot table will be displayed. Now there are 5 key sections of the field list to pay attention to. The first section on top lays out all of the columns available in your source data with check marks for any fields that are currently included somewhere in the pivot. In this case, we're looking at a simple data set containing only 4 fields, state, year, total population, and student population. Beneath that, you have 4 boxes: filters, columns, rows, and values. And these 4 boxes determine what data you're looking at and how it's filtered and organized in your pivot table. So I actually like to start in the lower right box and drag in any quantitative or numerical fields that I care about analyzing. In other words, these are the metrics that I can count, things like sales, revenue, population, clicks, etc. In the example shown here, we only care about total population. Now the next step is determining how we want to summarize those values. Do we want to see total population by state, by year, by something else? Depending on how you choose to summarize your values, in this case by state, you can drag that field to either the rows or the columns boxes. If I drag state into the rows box in the lower left, I'll end up with a pivot 50 rows tall with a row for each state along with the total population for each. If I drag state into the columns box in the upper right, I'll end up with a pivot 50 columns wide with a column for each state instead of a row. And then finally we have the filters box in the top left, where we can store any field that we might like to use to filter the entire pivot table view. By dragging in year like we see here, we're now able to view state populations for any specific year or any specific subselection of years by manipulating that filter. So let's jump into Excel and actually practice this. Alright, so here we are in Excel. We're in the new sheet that we created to insert a pivot based on our IMDb movie database tab. And over here on the right, we've got our field list with a nice blank canvas to work with. So first and foremost, let's double click that tab name and just name it pivot to be a bit more clear. And let's practice manipulating the fields in the field list to create different sorts of views within this pivot. So first and foremost, I'm going to scroll through and just see exactly what measures and dimensions I have to work with here. So I've got a number of different categorical fields like title, release date, genre, and I've got measures and numerical fields like reviews, revenues, budgets, etc. So to kick things off, I'm interested in seeing gross revenue for this data set. So I'm going to pull that in to the values box, and as you can see, it shows me just the total sum of all of the gross revenue in the entire data set. And I can actually drag that field in a few different ways, and vice versa. I can drag it out by just releasing it back into the field list. Now instead of clicking and dragging, I could have also just checked the box next to the variable name, and if Excel identifies that field as numerical, it will automatically populate the values box for me. So now obviously just seeing the total revenue for the entire data set isn't particularly helpful or useful in any way. What I really care about doing is breaking that revenue down and summarizing it at different levels and by different categorical fields. So to start, why don't we break down revenue by movie title? So I can click title and drop it right here in the rows box. What that gives me is one row for each title in the entire data set, along with the associated gross revenue total. Now I could have dragged title over here into the columns box, which gives me the correct numbers, but as you can see, it's really just not very readable or intuitive in that format. So I'm going to drag it back and keep it in the rows field for now. So this is nice. I've got gross revenue broken down by title. Next thing I can do is add a filter if I choose. So what if we only want to look at films for a particular country? I can click country and drag it right here into the filters box. And as you can see, Excel has added a new filter right above my view with the option to view data for a particular country or subset of countries. So I can click the box and say, okay, update my view to only show me films produced in Canada. And as you can see, the whole view updates accordingly. Or I can say only show me films in Australia, and there you go. And I don't have to be limited to just a single filter. I can also pull in language as well, so now I can filter by country, by language. I can pull in color or black and white. In this case, let's only look at color films in Australia, and you can see that our view updated. And the same goes for our row or column labels. Right now we're only breaking down the data by title, but we can drill deeper into this. So let's say we want to see gross revenue by both genre and title. See how it just nested these two fields together? So now I'm looking at the gross revenue by title and by genre. So within the action category for films produced in Australia that are in color, we find these particular titles, which drove this much revenue, and the genre as a whole drove this much revenue. So as you can see, we're getting more and more deeper insight into this data set that we never would have been able to easily see otherwise, just by clicking and dragging and dropping some fields using the field list. So now let's drag title out so that we're only looking at the revenue by genre. Just like we were able to add multiple filters and multiple row labels, we can also look at multiple value fields. So why don't we take budget and drag budget in as well. So now we're looking at revenue and budget by genre. Let's go ahead and clear these two filters so that we're no longer limited to just Australian color films. Now we're looking at all countries, all languages, all color or black and white films. So one thing you may have noticed when we added the second value field in here is that a new label popped up here in the columns box that says values. And basically, you can click and drag and move this values field around just like any other field. And what this does, it allows you to determine exactly how to organize the values in your pivot. So right now, the values are organized as columns. As you can see here, we've got a column for revenue and a column for budget. If we dragged this into the rows field after genre, you can see that now our values are organized or stacked one above the other in terms of rows. And as you move this, you can get a sense of what it's actually doing. So in this case, the values category comes first, all of the gross revenue figures first by genre, followed by all of the budget figures by genre beneath that. And then we can drag it back to columns, which is the default view. And that just gives you some flexibility if you want to adjust exactly how your values are organized in your pivot table view. So more on this to come later, but here's a quick primer on how to create and manipulate views using the pivot table field list. So once you've added a pivot table in Excel, you'll see a new menu header called Pivot Table Tools. And within that, two tabs, Analyze and Design. These tabs contain all of the tools and options that are specific to pivot tables. So for example, if we drill into the Analyze tab, here you'll find any tool and option that will help to supplement our analysis using this pivot table. We've got general options, we can expand and collapse fields, group things together, insert slicers and timelines, we can refresh the pivot or change the data source, clear, select, or move the entire table, we can add calculated fields, and even insert things like pivot charts. So we'll be diving into each of these tools in depth in the upcoming sections of the course. I just want to make you aware that this is where these tools live and that they're organized into these two tabs within the pivot tables header. So the second tab is Design, and this is where you can customize the look and feel of the table itself. So you can choose whether or not to show subtotals or grand totals. You can adjust the table layouts here, determine how to deal with blank rows or row headers. You can turn on or off banded rows or columns, and you can choose from specific pivot table styles, which just adjust the cell formatting and fill options to give it a unique look and feel. We'll also talk about creating your own styles as well in the next section of the course. So there you go. At a high level, pivot table tools include Analyze and Design options.